I want to thank Richard for inviting me here today, but I want to thank all of you for spending a few moments thinking and talking about a region we care about deeply, which is the Americas, our Western Hemisphere. And we have an extraordinarily distinguished group of people here today, and they've all been mentioned. So I suppose I should do what the South Africans would do and just say we have respected all protocols, so I don't have to repeat everybody's name again. But I do want just to acknowledge that having this kind of leadership from UC San Diego at this point, and from the community, and having the presence of the Gildred family here is incredibly important. And then some very dear colleagues of mine. It's wonderful to see Rafael Fernandez again after having worked with him so closely in government, knowing that he is here overseeing U.S.-Mexico issues is important. Having Jeff David out here, who is an icon in the United States Foreign Service and someone that American diplomats continue to admire and talk about. And to have Abe Lowenthal here, who has been an important mentor and guider over time, and someone who has played such a pivotal role in linking academia and and government theory and practice is quite remarkable. So it's just great to be here. It's great to be with so many wonderful people, and to be participating in the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Institute of the Americas and celebrating that founding. And as a new member of the Institute's board, I'm honored to have the opportunity to work with board members and the incredible staff of the Institute to build on the Institute's decades-long history of accomplishment and to help chart a future that hews to the vision of Ambassador Ted Gildred. A vision of an institute that defines itself through excellence in policy research and analysis, but also through its convoking power and the engagement and action it undertakes as a bridge between public and private sectors. And what a tremendous environment from which to accomplish these goals. On the campus of one of the most dynamic and innovative universities in our nation, alongside the Graduate School of Global Strategy and Policy, with its talent pool of regional and subject matter experts in the Western Hemisphere and Asian affairs, including China. And in close proximity to scientists and researchers across this campus and this city, working on cutting-edge advances in some of the most important technologies of the 21st century. This institute is important to me for reasons both personal and professional. As some of you know, I grew up in San Diego, although I'm a Minnesotan by birth. My family brought me here when I was 4, and I stayed here until I was 19. In fact, I graduated from Claremont High School, and I did my freshman here at UC San Diego at Revelle College. I was then taken away again to the East Coast and continued my education elsewhere. But the Triton spirit has always lived on. That 1 year was a lot. And my parents were very involved in San Diegan life. My father was Deputy Superintendent of Schools and Chief General Counsel for the San Diego Unified School District. My mother was a city commissioner, both on the Library Commission and the Housing Commission. And we lived through a period of incredible growth and change in San Diego, which continues to this day, which shows you just what an incredible, amazing place it is. So it's wonderful to be back in San Diego. But the Institute is important to me professionally because it can play a defining role in the larger debate about America's purpose in the world, the purpose of the United States in the world, and helping Americans understand the abiding importance of our hemisphere to the United States. And I want to take a moment to talk about that, and some of it has been touched on already by those who have spoken. But I'll start by noting that yesterday I had the extraordinary honor of being at the National Cathedral for the funeral service of Secretary of State Colin Powell. And it was quite a Washington event. There we were in the National Cathedral in a very high Anglican service with all of the military trappings that come with the general and the chairman of the Joint Staff, and the presence of President Biden and the First Lady, President Obama and Michelle Obama, and President Bush and Laura Bush, and also Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and Secretary of State Condi Rice and Madeleine Albright, who spoke. And the tributes to Powell were paid first by his Deputy Secretary, Dick Armitage, then by Madeleine Albright, which I thought was a very intelligent way of underscoring Secretary Powell's bipartisan political life, and then by his son, Michael Powell, who gave an extraordinarily touching and beautiful rendition of his father's life and the impact of his father's life on him. But what was very striking for me was, aside from the covering of Washington power and society, is that the Powell family went out of its way not to invite the rest of the upper crust of Washington, D.C., but to look for people who had worked with Colin Powell, both in the Army, at the Pentagon, at the White House when he was National Security Advisor, and at the Department of State when he was Secretary of State. And so for me, it was almost kind of a family reunion or a college reunion, because I just got to see people that I had worked with in different iterations across a career, and to see how all these worlds touched because of Secretary Powell. And in many ways, it was a celebration of service. It was a celebration of Secretary Powell's service, but it was a celebration of all those who had served with him. And the reason this was important and worth mentioning here is that I was with Secretary Powell in Lima, Peru on September 11th, 2001. You might not remember this, but Secretary Powell was not in the United States when the attacks happened. He was in Lima, Peru at a special assembly of the organization, a special general assembly at the Organization of American States, where the members of the OAS were contemplating the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The Inter-American Democratic Charter is something that came out of the Summit of the Americas process and out of the Quebec City Summit of the Americas process, which was President Bush's first Summit of the Americas, in which the leaders of the hemisphere had determined that democracy was the only legitimate form of government in our hemisphere. And in order to be part of the summit, you had to be democratic, and that any country that had a significant rupture in its constitutional order or its democratic practice could not take part in the summit. But the leaders wanted to find a way for the OAS to build some jurisprudence around that and some legal language that would require countries in the region to be democratic if they wanted to participate in the larger multilateral practices and institutions of the region. And so they instructed foreign ministers to negotiate an Inter-American Democratic Charter, to describe what democracy is and what it should be, and look for a way to hold countries accountable to living by it. And it was a remarkable period of negotiation. The summit was in April. We had an initial review of the draft document in June, and then the final kind of concluding meeting of foreign ministers in September. And I flew down with Secretary Powell on his aircraft, and we had an opportunity to talk about the charter and what it meant. And then that evening, the Peruvian Foreign Ministry held a large reception. And we knew that there were several countries that were going to try to block the Inter-American Democratic Charter, two in particular, Haiti and Venezuela, because of concerns they had that the charter would be used against them. And we were looking for ways to maneuver this so that we could win consensus approval. And of course, in the morning, as we were all preparing for the first session of the Special General Assembly, the first plane hits the Twin Towers. Secretary Powell is having breakfast with the Peruvian president at the time, President Toledo. And by the end of the breakfast, the second plane has hit. And then the plane hits the Pentagon. And when Secretary Powell leaves that breakfast, he knows that we're at war. He's not quite sure who we're going to fight, but he knows we're at war. And I remember at the time there was a big decision to make, because he could go to the airport and get on the plane and leave, or he could stay, go to the opening session of the Special General Assembly, make his pitch for the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and see what he could get done, and then go to the aircraft. To his lasting credit, he decided to stay a few hours longer in Lima. And although he had a pretty good speech ready on the Inter-American Democratic Charter, he decided to throw it away and instead make an impassioned plea for the charter based not only on the work that had been done by all the countries present in terms of defining democracy and its components and understanding how it could be projected into the hemisphere, but also by linking it to open societies, to individual freedoms and liberty, and how we understand ourselves as peoples and cultures and how we relate to our states. And saying that the attack in the United States was not only an attack on the United States, it was an attack on democracies and open societies everywhere. It was an attack on individual liberties and freedoms everywhere. And this was a speech of extraordinary power. It was extemporaneous, and it had a galvanizing impact among the foreign ministers, and it carried the day, and the Inter-American Democratic Charter was approved. But that was not his only accomplishment that day. He also convinced the foreign ministers around the table to refer back to their capitals and to their leaders in order to invoke the Rio Treaty. The Rio Treaty is a collective security treaty which was negotiated during World War II, in which the countries of the hemisphere committed to protect each other in moments of external aggression. And what many people don't realize is that the Western Hemisphere, our neighbors here in the Americas, invoked a collective security treaty before NATO did. And this was Secretary Powell's accomplishment. And what he was able to do in that day, in those hours that he was in Lima, is link democracy and security and link the Americas in a way that we were not only kind of politically aligned, but we are aligned in terms of security. And this was an early accomplishment of Secretary Powell's tenure, but I think in many ways it was certainly one of his most important and one of his most long-lasting. And this brings me to a larger theme, which is really the nature of democracy in our hemisphere and how it relates to everything else that we do. And if you were to read the Inter-American Democratic Charter, to the substantive components of it, the first article makes a very bold assertion. It says that the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy, and the governments of the Americas have an obligation and a duty to promote and defend it. Now, when we were negotiating that language, the lawyers at the State Department were very uncomfortable with the idea that anybody has a right to democracy. They said democracy is a form of government. You can't have a right to a form of government. You can have a right to the component parts of a democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of belief. But how can you have a right to a form of government? That will open up issues of liability that are very difficult to manage. But after a lot of back and forth, we were able to win broad agreement through the hemisphere that indeed peoples have a right to democracy. And what that reflected in the hemisphere is that this is a hemisphere that had gone through any number of different types of governance, from authoritarian government to military government to revolutionary government, and had determined that none of them worked. Some of them produced economic growth, but they had great difficulty in sharing that growth. And therefore, the region was determined that its advancement had to be done in a democratic fashion. And the second article substantive article of the treaty says that democracy is essential to the political, social, and economic development of the Americas. In other words, the region was asserting that there's a democratic model of development that is necessary if development is going to be meaningful in a social and economic sense. And for me, at least, this was profound. No other region of the world had committed itself so explicitly to democracy, and no other region of the world had committed itself so explicitly to a democratic model of development. And the region that was committing itself to this understanding and conception of democracy was a region that was plagued by poverty, by inequality, by social exclusion, and yet which understood that in order for the region to advance, that it needed to find a way to have that advancement done in ways that all citizens understood and participated in. And this brings me to a larger point, which is that the region was clearly stating that democratic government was not the purpose. The purpose was a democratic society. And the purpose was using democratic institutions and tools to create a democratic society. And what I mean by that is that democratic governance creates peaceful transfers of power. It opens opportunities for citizens to choose their leaders and to have a voice in national destiny. And that's all important. But what the peoples of the Americas were saying to each other and to us is that having a voice in choosing national destiny is not enough. You have to have a voice in determining individual destiny. You have to have access to the resources, to the education, to the health care, to the security necessary for individuals to believe and feel that they are somehow capable of achieving their own sense of themselves and their own individual destiny, something our founding fathers called the pursuit of happiness. And I think in many ways, as we look out into the region, and Richard did a very good job of kind of laying out the panorama that we face right now, the challenges that we face right now, and they are significant. We have a region that has been fractured by the pandemic and fragmented by the pandemic, in which many of the structures that we used to build political dialogue and economic regional integration have been interrupted, in which borders have been closed. Countries have sought to keep people away. And in which internally, much of the cohesiveness of these societies has also been worn down, with children not going to school. Fully 75% of the children in Latin America right now are not back in classrooms. But as we face and understand that reality, and as we look for ways to address it, I think it's important to recognize and understand that if we understand democracy only in terms of institutions and only in terms of rule of law and only in terms of the institutional dynamics of checks and balances and independent powers of government, we're going to miss something important. And we will be arguing for a democracy that is a status quo form of government, and that we need to have the agility and the flexibility and the intellectual vision to understand, as Secretary Tony Blinken said in a speech he gave in Quito, Ecuador recently on democracy, that democracy has to deliver the goods. It has to find a way to ensure that people believe that it is improving their lives and creating the possibility for them to achieve the kind of individual destinies they want. And this, I believe, is where the Institute can play a hugely important role for all the reasons that people have talked about today. This is an institute that is a convoker, a convener. It's an institute that bridges public and private sectors. It's an institute that finds a way to draw into a larger conversation the hugely important advances that are taking place technologically, socially, and economically, and do it in a way that resonates and can be heard beyond the beauty of this setting. And I'm convinced, and this is why I'm on the board, this is why I'm committed to the Institute, and this is why I'm here today. I'm convinced that this is an institution, an entity that founded here on the frontier with our most important bilateral partner, Mexico, and as part of a larger North American complex, social, economic, cultural, and political, and connecting along the Pacific Rim with all of these countries that have negotiated free trade agreements with the United States, and then linking into that part of South America, Brazil, Argentina, and beyond, that have huge markets, huge mineral resources, huge agricultural capacity, and who will play a very important role in fashioning the globalization of the Americas, especially Latin America, and facing the Pacific and facing into Asia, that this is a unique place to begin a larger conversation in the United States about what the region means for us and how we have to rethink our engagement in the region and how we have to commit ourselves to ensuring that we have an agenda with the region that's positive, an agenda that resonates beyond governments but with peoples, and that shows clearly that we are relevant to the success of the region and to all our partners in it. Because if we cannot do that, the region will turn away from us. It will turn to others who are not going to make the same kinds of political demands or take the same kind of punitive actions against them, and which will provide them resources which, while maybe not ideal, can be had at a much cheaper political cost. And when you think about this, think about what we and our partners in the region have been able to accomplish over the last several decades, really over the decades that define the trajectory of this institute. We have helped create a hemisphere that is committed to democracy and committed to the political values of democracy. We have created a hemisphere that is market-oriented and built around market economics. We have created a hemisphere that realizes that regional integration and trade, regional economic integration and trade, are drivers of growth and prosperity. And we've created a region with the most sophisticated and detailed institutional structures to promote political dialogue and resolve disputes. In other words, we have in the Western Hemisphere, if you're the United States, a strategic reserve of relative peace and prosperity with extraordinary resources and ability to globalize on our own terms. And this is a strategic advantage to the United States that no other great power has. Not China, not Russia. No other middle power has. Not Iran, not Nigeria, not Turkey, not Japan, not Korea, not even Australia. But the United States has it, and all of our neighbors, because of the way we've constructed this hemisphere, has it. And this is something we need to preserve, because we are moving into a world which, to use a polite term, is going to be contested, in which everything we do is going to be resisted or managed in some way by other powers who have different understandings of what it is we're trying to accomplish. And it's also going to be a world in which, even though the United States will remain for some time the only true superpower, the only true power with the capability of projecting that power anywhere at any time, the reality is it is a country that cannot project its power everywhere all the time. And therefore, it has to be judicious about the decisions it makes. It has to understand the importance of alliances and partnerships. And it has to understand the remarkable transformative power that exists in our societies, in the citizens of our countries throughout this hemisphere, in their common commitment to democracy, to common understandings of the role of the individual and the role of the state, common understandings of economics and markets, but a deep and abiding commitment to the well-being of the individual and the liberty that all women and men deserve. So let me close by saying that this is a region, even in moments of great challenge, that has the ability to lift itself above these challenges and has the ability and the proven capability of working together and doing so in ways that produce results that have deep and profound impact, not only in our own hemisphere, but beyond. And in this regard, I truly believe that the Institute of the Americas can play a central role in helping Americans understand this at a very important moment in our national history, where we're having a larger debate about America's purpose in the world. And because of its connectivity in the region, but especially because of its historic connectivity into Mexico, can help fashion a larger dialogue that can promote understanding that is going to be to all of our benefit. So I appreciate your patience today in listening to me. I thank the Institute for this honor, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you very much.